You've heard the word 1,000 times. Someone asks where you're going on Friday, you say, "I don't know, Timbuktu," and everyone laughs. Your parents used it when they wanted to say something was impossibly far away. Teachers used it to describe the back of beyond, Timbuktu, the ultimate nowhere, the joke place, the made-up sounding destination that isn't supposed to actually exist. Except it does exist. It's a real city. It's in Mali, West Africa. And here's what nobody tells you. At its peak, Timbuktu wasn't the middle of nowhere. It was the middle of everything. While European scholars were still arguing about whether the Earth was flat, genuinely debating it in universities in the 1300s, Timbuktu had 25,000 students enrolled in advanced courses on astronomy, mathematics, surgery, and law. While the Black Death was wiping out a third of Europe's population, Timbuktu's physicians were performing cataract surgery using techniques that wouldn't reach European medicine for another 200 years. While Rome was eating itself alive in political chaos, Timbuktu's king went on vacation and accidentally destroyed Egypt's entire economy, just by being too generous with his pocket money. That's the city we're talking about tonight. Not a myth, not a legend, not probably exaggerated. This is documented in hundreds of thousands of surviving manuscripts, confirmed by multiple independent sources, and sitting in the middle of the Sahara Desert, daring you to explain how it happened. So let's explain it. Picture yourself standing at the edge of the Sahara in the year 1324. The sand stretches to the horizon in every direction, shimmering in heat so intense the air looks like it's melting. You've been traveling for 2 months, crossing desert that doesn't care whether you live or die. And the city you finally see rising from the sand doesn't look like much. No massive stone walls like Constantinople, no soaring Gothic cathedrals like Paris. Just these organic, breathing structures made of mud and straw, earth tones melting into earth tones. But get closer, look harder. That's gold leaf on that mosque. Those crowds in the marketplace, they're dressed in indigo robes so deeply, richly blue they're almost black, a color so expensive in Europe that only royalty can afford it. Everyone here is just casually draped in what would be your king's coronation outfit. The air smells like frankincense, myrrh, and a dozen spices from across the known world. You hear Arabic mixing with Songhai, mixing with Tamashek, mixing with Fulani and 10 other languages. A student bumps into you clutching a leather-bound book like it's a diamond, because to him, it basically is. This is Timbuktu, a city that shouldn't exist in a location that should be empty wasteland, that somehow became the richest and most educated metropolis on Earth in the medieval world. And you're about to find out exactly how they pulled it off. Let's talk about salt. I know. Stay with me. Salt. The thing sitting in a shaker on your kitchen table. The stuff you mindlessly dump on fries. The most boring substance in human history. Right? Wrong. You're in the 14th century now, and salt isn't seasoning. Salt is survival technology. It's the difference between eating rotten meat and making it through winter. It's the electrolytes keeping your body alive when you're sweating out everything you have in 110-degree desert heat. It's medicine, preservative, and currency all rolled into one white crystal. In a world without refrigeration, without IV drips, without modern medicine, salt is life. Literal, actual life. And here's the thing nobody tells you. The Sahara Desert is sitting on top of one of the largest salt deposits on Earth. Up in a place called Tagaza, about 500 miles north of Timbuktu, there are slabs of pure salt so thick, so dense, so absolutely massive that miners don't scoop it out of the ground like regular ore. They cut it, like stone. These blocks weigh up to 200 pounds each, and the miners hack them out of the earth by hand in brutal desert heat, and then stack them in long rows waiting for the caravans. Here's the detail that breaks your brain. The miners at Tagaza live in houses built from salt blocks. They eat food prepared on salt slabs. They sleep on salt, They exist inside what is essentially a giant, scorching hot salt mine, and they never leave. Because the economics of the trans-Saharan salt trade keep them there whether they want to be or not. It's one of the most miserable jobs in human history, and it was also one of the most economically critical. The whole medieval West African economy runs on what these people dig out of the ground. Now you're watching a caravan prepare to leave Taghaza. How many camels? 12,000. Read that again. 12,000 camels, all loaded down with salt blocks. That's not a typo, and it's not an exaggeration. Arab historians documented caravans of this size multiple times. These things were so massive, they created their own weather systems. The dust cloud was visible from miles away. The sound of thousands of camel bells created this eerie, clanking desert symphony you could hear long before you could see the animals. The journey from Taghaza to Timbuktu takes about 20 days if everything goes right. Spoiler, everything rarely goes right. Sandstorms can bury entire sections of the caravan. Not slow the caravan down, bury it. Water sources marked on maps from the previous year might have dried up. Bandits occasionally test their luck, though attacking a caravan of 12,000 camels is essentially a suicidal career choice. But the journey happens anyway, every season, because of what waits at the other end. Here's Timbuktu's secret weapon. Location. The city sits at the exact spot where the Sahara Desert meets the Niger River. Salt comes down from the north. Gold, ivory, and enslaved people come up from the south, out of the forests and gold fields of West Africa, where gold is almost absurdly abundant. Timbuktu is the switching point, the hub where everything changes hands, gets taxed, gets loaded onto different vehicles, and moves on. And here's the exchange rate that will genuinely make you stop and stare at the wall for a second. In the forests of West Africa, salt is so rare and gold is so common that traders would give you equal weight. 1 pound of salt for 1 pound of gold. Pound. 4 pound. A substance you can literally mine out of the ground in enormous chunks, traded weight for weight with the most precious metal on earth. Think about what that means for Timbuktu. You don't mine the salt, you don't mine the gold, you just control the point where these two things meet. You tax both sides of every transaction. You sit in the middle and collect a cut from everything moving in every direction, and you get obscenely, generationally, dynastically wealthy without doing any of the dangerous work yourself. It's the medieval version of owning the platform. These people basically invented Amazon, except with camels instead of delivery trucks, no customer service hotline, and margins that would make Jeff Bezos weep with envy. The merchants of Timbuktu build credit systems that work across thousands of miles without banks, without police enforcement, without written contracts in most cases. Your word is your bond, literally. Because if you screw someone in Timbuktu's trading network, that gossip travels faster than the caravans, and you'll never do business again. You can take a line of credit in Timbuktu and cash it in Cairo. Historians are still trying to fully understand how these medieval African financial systems worked so smoothly, but they did, often better than their European equivalents. You walk through the salt market, and it's magnificent chaos. Merchants are shouting prices in 4 languages simultaneously. There's an elaborate system of hand signals for negotiating, a secret language of fingers and palm positions that closes deals worth kingdoms, no paper required. Everything runs on memory and reputation, and both are fiercely protected. Here's a small detail historians love. The salt blocks themselves become a form of currency. You can break off pieces for smaller transactions. There are standardized sizes that everyone recognizes. It's like having a wallet made of actual money. Except the money can also save your life if you're dying of heat exhaustion. Better than money. Much better than money. This whole machine is so efficient, so perfectly positioned, so relentlessly profitable that Timbuktu's ruling class achieves a level of wealth that most medieval societies couldn't even conceptualize. And they do it not by conquering anyone, not by mining anything themselves, but purely by controlling the moment when salt meets gold. Remember that. It matters for everything that comes next. You're in Timbuktu on a summer morning in 1324, and something unprecedented is happening. Word has spread through the city that Mansa Musa, the Emperor of Mali, the man who literally owns Timbuktu and roughly half of West Africa, is leaving on his pilgrimage to Mecca. And he's not traveling light. You watch the caravan assemble, and your brain struggles to process the scale. 60,000 people. Let that number sit there for a second. 60,000 people, all traveling together across the Sahara Desert, through Egypt, and eventually to the holiest site in Islam. This isn't a pilgrimage. This is a moving nation-state. This is an entire city deciding to take a road trip. But here's the part that breaks the scale entirely. Musa is bringing between 80 and 100 camels, and each camel is carrying 300 pounds of pure gold. Do the math. That's somewhere between 12 and 15 tons of gold, just casually loaded onto animals as spending money for a religious vacation. He's also got 500 enslaved people walking ahead of him, each one carrying a solid gold staff weighing about 4 pounds. This isn't wealth. This is wealth performing for an audience, and the audience is the entire medieval world. Mansa Musa knows exactly what he's doing. He wants the world to understand that Mali exists, that Africa isn't some empty space at the edge of the map, that Timbuktu and its empire are not minor players. They are the players. He's about to conduct the most spectacular piece of medieval geopolitical branding in human history, and he's going to pull it off by doing something devastatingly simple. He's going to give everything away. Fast forward a few months. You're now in Cairo. Mansa Musa's caravan has arrived, and the Egyptian Sultan comes out to greet him, expecting the usual diplomatic exchange. Some nice gifts, a bit of ceremony, the standard routine. Instead, Musa starts handing out gold like it's candy at a parade. Not small coins, not polite tokens. Chunks of gold given to literally everyone within arm's reach. Government officials, scholars, street vendors, random people who happen to be standing nearby, beggars. It doesn't matter. If you're close enough to make eye contact with Mansa Musa's people, you're getting gold today. He tears through the markets of Cairo like a force of nature. Textiles, food, luxury goods. He buys everything, pays over asking price, tips extravagantly, never haggles. Why would he haggle? He has 15 tons of the stuff. Haggling would be like you arguing over the price of a sandwich while sitting on a mountain of cash. And here's where it gets economically catastrophic and kind of hilarious. Supply and demand is a brutal, indifferent law. When you suddenly flood a market with enormous quantities of gold, gold becomes less valuable. Price crashes. The Egyptian gold market doesn't just dip, it collapses. The value of gold in Egypt drops by 20 to 25% and stays depressed for over a decade. Over a decade. Merchants who had built their entire businesses around gold trading wake up one morning to find their inventory is worth a quarter less than it was yesterday, and it's going to stay that way for 10 years. One man, one trip, tanked an entire country's economy just by being too generous. Historians are genuinely still debating whether Musa understood what he was doing. Some argue it was a calculated power move, the ultimate flex, a way of saying, I have so much wealth I can break your markets without even trying, and I'm not even paying attention. Others think he was simply being charitable and had no idea about the economic consequences. He was a genuinely pious man going on a religious pilgrimage, and generosity is literally commanded by his faith. Maybe he just gave, and the math turned out to be someone else's problem. Here's my favorite detail of this entire story. On his way back from Mecca, Musa realizes he's a problem he created for himself. He's been so extraordinarily generous that his own retinue is running short on funds for the return journey. So you know what the richest human being on Earth does? He takes out a loan. Mansa Musa, the man who just crashed Egypt's economy with his vacation budget, borrows money from Cairo merchants to get home. And even this becomes legendary, because the terms he negotiates are so favorable it functions as another display of power. He's essentially borrowing his own gold, back at a discount, from people whose market he just destroyed. And they're still thrilled to do business with him because his creditworthiness is obviously flawless. The ripple effects of this pilgrimage are enormous and immediate. European mapmakers, who barely knew sub-Saharan Africa existed, scrambled to update their charts. The Catalan Atlas of 1375, one of the most important maps of the medieval world, shows Mansa Musa sitting on a golden throne in West Africa, holding a gold nugget the size of an apple. The caption essentially reads, "This is the richest king in the world." Not the richest king in Africa, the richest king in the world. Timbuktu transforms overnight from a regional trade hub into the city everyone is talking about from Lisbon to Constantinople. And Musa doesn't stop there. He comes back from Mecca with architects, scholars, and builders in tow. People he essentially recruited by offering them amounts of money too absurd to refuse. The famous Jingareba Mosque that still stands in Timbuktu today, that's Musa's doing. Designed by a poet-architect named Abu Ishaq al-Sahili, a man Musa met in Mecca and hired on the spot by offering him 200 pounds of gold just to make the journey. Not to build the mosque, just to show up and consider the project. That's the economy we're talking about. Musa also returns with something more valuable than architects: connections. He's made relationships with universities in Cairo and Mecca. He's brought back scholars. He's positioned Timbuktu, deliberately, strategically, as the intellectual capital of West Africa. The pilgrimage wasn't just religious. It was a branding exercise, a diplomatic mission, and a talent acquisition trip all rolled into one. Medieval genius. One final detail, and then we move on. Historians and economists have spent decades trying to calculate exactly how wealthy Mansa Musa was. Modern estimates range from $400 billion to simply incalculably wealthy. His empire controlled roughly half the world's gold supply at the time. There's no number that actually captures it. He didn't just break the Egyptian economy. He broke the scale we use to measure wealth entirely. We haven't invented the unit of measurement that applies to Mansa Musa. We probably never will. You're walking through Timbuktu's scholarly quarter, and you hear something that should not exist. Heated academic debate. Not prayers, not merchants haggling. Actual, passionate, technically sophisticated arguments about astronomy, mathematics, and Islamic jurisprudence. The kind of arguments where someone slams a manuscript down on a table and says, "Read this again, because you are wrong." You follow the sound, turn a corner, and suddenly you're standing in front of Sankore University. It's packed, not with dozens of students, not even hundreds. At its peak, Sankore has between 20,000 and 25,000 enrolled students, more than many modern universities have today. And this is happening in the middle of the Sahara Desert 600 years ago, in a city Europeans haven't even found on a map yet. Let that land. While Oxford and Cambridge were just getting off the ground, mostly teaching basic theology to a few hundred wealthy boys who could afford the fees. Sankore is running a full-scale advanced research institution drawing students from Persia, North Africa, and Al-Andalus in Spain. People are traveling thousands of miles, on foot, by camel, across deserts and mountains, to come study here, because Timbuktu has become the place to be if you're serious about scholarship. The curriculum is not a joke. Astronomy courses where students calculate planetary movements and eclipse predictions with shocking accuracy. Medicine, surgical procedures, herbal pharmacology, anatomical understanding that won't reach European practice for another century or more. Advanced mathematics including algebraic concepts that most European scholars won't encounter until the Renaissance, when they finally start translating Arabic texts and realizing they've been centuries behind. Philosophy, rhetoric, formal logic, Islamic jurisprudence across 12 different schools of thought. Grammar, history, linguistics. It's comprehensive in a way that makes most medieval European education look like a warm-up act. Here's something historians find fascinating about how Sankore actually worked. Unlike European universities with their formal bureaucratic charters and rigid institutional structures, Sankore operates more like a network of independent masters. You don't enroll in a school. You attach yourself to a specific scholar, a teacher with a reputation, a body of original work, a lineage of intellectual credibility. You study with them, sometimes for years, learning not just from formal lectures, but from copying manuscripts, engaging in live debate, and eventually producing your own original scholarship. It's a mentorship model that is, surprisingly, quite modern in its approach. Sit in on an astronomy lecture. The professor is working with an astrolabe, a beautiful, intricate brass instrument that looks like something a steampunk jeweler made on commission but is actually a sophisticated astronomical calculator capable of determining prayer times from any location on Earth, navigating by stars and predicting the position of celestial bodies months in advance. The students around you are taking notes on wooden boards, coated in a mixture they can wash clean and reuse because paper is expensive even here. Final knowledge gets copied onto actual manuscripts. Everything else is scratch work, erased and written over, erased again. The diversity in that room would shock you. Sons of wealthy merchants sit next to scholarship students from poor families who showed exceptional intellectual promise. There is genuine meritocracy operating here. If you're brilliant, doors open. Money helps, obviously. You need funds for living expenses and books. But talent is valued in a way that's genuinely progressive for the medieval world. And here's something that would especially shock a medieval European visitor. There are women in some of those classes, not tokens, not exceptions. Women scholars exist as part of an established tradition in Timbuktu's intellectual life. Figures like Aisha al-Barnawi and Fatima bint al-Imam taught students, wrote legal commentaries, and issued religious opinions that male scholars cited and respected. Some women ran their own study circles. Some taught in neighborhood mosques. They weren't the majority. This wasn't gender equality by modern standards. But compared to medieval Europe, where women were systematically excluded from higher education entirely, Timbuktu is operating in a different universe. The library situation is almost incomprehensible. Sankore's institutional collection runs into the hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, but that's just the university. The private libraries, owned by wealthy families throughout the city, sometimes contain tens of thousands of volumes each. You're in a city where books are simultaneously the most valuable possession a family can own, a form of currency, a status symbol, a financial investment, and a family heirloom passed down through generations with the same gravity as property and gold. When a daughter gets married, her dowry might include manuscripts. When a patriarch dies, his book collection is divided among heirs with intense contractual precision. Families go into debt to acquire rare texts because owning important manuscripts means you are somebody. It signals wealth, education, religious devotion, political connections, all at once. It's like collecting rare art, except the art is also a functional knowledge base that can change your life and your children's lives. And here's what makes Timbuktu unique beyond simply collecting knowledge from elsewhere. Original scholarship is being produced here. Timbuktu's scholars aren't just copying texts from Cairo and Baghdad. They're writing their own treatises, conducting original research, developing new interpretations that account for West African realities, studies of local languages and grammar, original mathematical proofs, histories of the region told from the inside. new legal commentaries that synthesize Islamic jurisprudence with local custom. This is not a city consuming knowledge. It is generating it. Now let's talk about the manuscripts themselves, because these objects are extraordinary. You watch a scribe at work, and it's genuinely mesmerizing. He's using ink made from soot, tree bark, and other organic compounds mixed to precise recipes refined over generations. The paper comes from North Africa or Egypt. Expensive, precious, not a sheet to be wasted. A significant mistake means scraping the ink off carefully and starting again, or losing the page entirely. The calligraphy is not merely functional. It's gorgeous, Arabic script that transforms text into visual art, letters flowing into each other with a beauty that makes you want to slow down and just look at the page before you read it. The most important manuscripts get illuminated, decorative geometric borders in the margins, gold leaf on section headings, vivid colors, reds from crushed insects, deep blues from ground minerals, warm yellows from plant extracts. These aren't books. They're masterpieces that happen to contain information. A skilled scribe can earn more than most merchants. The demand for quality copies of important texts is so fierce and the skills so specialized that top scribes are genuinely wealthy people. Some become wealthy enough to build their own libraries, creating this extraordinary cycle where the people preserving knowledge can afford to collect it. One subject covered in these private libraries deserves to be called out specifically because it destroys a specific myth about African history with surgical precision. Cataract surgery. Medieval African manuscripts from Timbuktu describe detailed surgical procedures for removing cataracts, the clouding of the eye's lens that causes blindness. The techniques documented in these texts wouldn't be widely practiced in European medicine for centuries after. In the 1400s, in a city that Europeans thought was primitive wilderness, surgeons were restoring people's sight using methods that European doctors hadn't figured out yet. Read that as many times as you need to. You're standing in front of the Jingareba Mosque, and your first reaction is confusion. It looks like a sandcastle, an enormous, ambitious, structurally confident sandcastle, but a sandcastle nonetheless. The entire thing is built from mud bricks, technically a mixture called banko. Mud, rice husks, and shea butter packed together and dried in the desert sun. By every logical principle you understand about construction, this building should not exist. Mud dissolves in rain. Mud crumbles under heat stress. Mud is what you build with when you have nothing better available. And yet this mosque has been standing since 1327, not as a ruin, not as a crumbling archaeological site you peer at through protective fencing. As a functioning, intact, actively used building, still the centerpiece of Timbuktu's skyline, still calling people to prayer, still standing in one of the harshest environments on Earth after nearly 700 years. So how? Look at those wooden beams sticking out of the walls at odd angles. Your instinct is to call them decorative, some kind of architectural quirk, a stylistic choice. They are not decorative. They are permanent scaffolding, built directly into the structure of the walls, and they exist for one specific purpose, the crépissage. Every year, before the rainy season, the entire community of Timbuktu comes together for a festival. Not a festival of music or food, a festival of mud. The crépissage is the annual replastering of the mosque's exterior walls, where hundreds of people climb those wooden beam scaffolds and apply fresh banko to every surface, giving the building a new skin before the rains can eat through the old one. It is simultaneously a feat of engineering, a community ritual, and a masterclass in preventive maintenance. The mosque heals itself every year, on purpose, by design. The architects who built this understood something profound. In a desert environment, you don't build a structure to resist the elements indefinitely and hope it holds. You build a structure that can be continuously renewed by the community that depends on it. The building and the people exist in a relationship. The mosque needs the community, and the community needs the mosque, and that mutual dependency is literally engineered into the walls. Go inside, and the genius compounds. Those walls are 3 to 4 feet thick in places. In a brutal Saharan summer where exterior temperatures can hit 120 degrees Fahrenheit, the massive earthen walls absorb heat slowly during the day, taking hours to warm through, and release it slowly at night. Inside the mosque, at peak afternoon heat, when the air outside is a physical assault, the interior is genuinely, remarkably cool. Not air-conditioned cool, but cool enough to breathe, cool enough to think, cool enough to pray in comfort. Passive climate control, zero energy input, engineered from mud, physics, and centuries of accumulated desert knowledge. The prayer hall inside is a forest of tapered columns, wider at the base, narrowing toward the top, distributing weight in a way that prevents the mud brick from cracking under structural stress. The ceiling has ventilation holes positioned to pull hot air upward and out, while drawing cooler air in from the shaded entrances below. The whole interior is a carefully calibrated airflow system that someone designed by understanding exactly how heat moves through space. The geometric patterns decorating the mihrab, the niche indicating the direction of Mecca, are not random, pretty shapes. They're based on complex mathematical ratios and symmetries that reflect Islamic principles about the order and unity of creation. Some of these patterns involve calculations that wouldn't be formalized in European mathematics for another few centuries. The decoration is also the math. The beauty is also the proof. What's stunning is how this architectural philosophy spreads throughout the entire city. The techniques developed for Djinguereber get replicated in private homes, neighborhood mosques, schools, libraries. Timbuktu develops a completely cohesive built aesthetic. Earthen buildings with wooden beam protrusions, flat accessible rooftops reached by external staircases, internal courtyards designed to maximize shade and capture airflow. From above, the city looks like it grew organically from the desert itself, which, in a very real sense, it did. The construction process is communal in a way that has no modern Western equivalent. When someone needs to build or repair a structure, they don't hire a contractor and stay out of the way. Neighbors come together, mixing mud, forming bricks, laying walls, plastering surfaces. There is collective knowledge about desert architecture that everyone carries, passed down through generations of living in extreme conditions and methodically figuring out what survives. These buildings are not just shelter. They are a physical archive of accumulated survival wisdom, refined over centuries of trial and error, encoded into every wall thickness and beam angle and drainage slope. And once a year, the whole city climbs up together and makes sure it stays that way. That's the crépissage. That's Timbuktu's architecture. That's what it looks like when a civilization solves its environment instead of fighting it. Now we need to talk about what happens when the Golden Age ends, because it ends badly. The first cracks appear quietly, the way structural damage always does. Invisible from the outside, accumulating in the foundations, not obvious until the moment everything shifts at once. You're in Timbuktu around the 1470s and something feels different. The markets are still busy. The universities still have students. The mosques still call people to prayer 5 times a day. But there's an anxiety underneath everything, conversations that stop when strangers approach, merchants studying their accounting books with expressions that don't match the activity around them. The problem is geography. Specifically, Portuguese sailors have figured something out. You can sail down the West African coast and trade directly with the gold-producing regions. No desert crossing, no 12,000 camel caravan, no Timbuktu middleman taking a cut from both sides of the transaction. The Portuguese build São Jorge da Mina on the coast in 1482, a fortress trading post. And suddenly, there is a competing route for West African gold to reach Mediterranean and European markets. and that route completely bypasses everything that made Timbuktu's location valuable. It's not an immediate collapse. The city is still wealthy, still trading, still important, but you can feel the volume shifting. The margins are getting thinner. Caravans that used to number 12,000 camels now come in at 3,000 or 4,000. Still substantial. But the trajectory is clear to anyone willing to read it honestly. The sharpest merchants start quietly moving assets. Not panicking, just diversifying, hedging, relocating wealth to coastal cities where the new trade routes run. They can read the accounting books, year after year, slightly less. Year after year, the trend pointing in one direction, then the political situation deteriorates in that messy, grinding way that large empires always eventually deteriorate. The Mali Empire weakens, power fragments. Regional governors become effectively independent. Timbuktu changes hands between competing powers. The Tuareg, then the rising Songhai Empire. There are good periods and bad ones. Askia Muhammad, the Songhai ruler who comes to power in the 1490s, is genuinely good for Timbuktu. He goes on his own Mecca pilgrimage, positions himself as a proper Islamic ruler, expands the universities, attracts new scholars. There's something like a renaissance. But it's the last gasp, not the beginning of a new era. The underlying economic shift is irreversible. Wealth is draining from the trans-Saharan routes, slowly but consistently, like water finding its own level. The Golden Age isn't ending in a single dramatic moment. It's ending the way most Golden Ages actually end, in a long, gradual, heartbreaking diminishment, where each year is only slightly worse than the last. And then one day you look up and realize the world has completely changed around you. And then 1591 arrives, and the slow decline becomes a catastrophe. You're in Timbuktu on a morning in 1591, and the city is about to experience the worst thing that has ever happened to it. Word has been spreading for weeks. A Moroccan army is crossing the Sahara. Sultan Ahmad al-Mansur of Morocco wants Timbuktu's gold, not to trade for it, not to tax it, but to simply take it. And he's sent approximately 4,000 soldiers equipped with something West Africa has never encountered at scale: firearms. The Songhai Empire scrambles its forces to stop them. They send out an army that massively outnumbers the Moroccans, somewhere between 30,000 and 40,000 soldiers, battle-hardened warriors who have defended this territory for generations. On paper, this should not even be a contest. At the Battle of Tondibi, just outside Gao, the Songhai forces get annihilated. This is the brutal, unromantic reality of military technology gaps. Traditional weapons against gunpowder weapons is not a fight, it's a demonstration. The Moroccan arquebuses, early muskets, mow down cavalry charges and infantry formations that would have been devastating against any conventional opponent. The noise alone terrifies horses that have never heard gunfire. Trained war horses, animals that will charge into sword lines without flinching, break and scatter at the sound of a musket volley. The Songhai army collapses not from cowardice, but from the sheer incomprehensibility of what's being done to them. They have no framework for this. Timbuktu is now defenseless. The Moroccan commander who enters the city is a man named Judah Pasha, a Spanish eunuch if you want the full surreal detail of it. And initially he tries to maintain order. He's a professional. He understands that Timbuktu's value is ongoing revenue, not a one-time ransack. The city is supposed to become a Moroccan colony, a source of taxes and gold flowing north across the Sahara indefinitely. The problem, Timbuktu doesn't have vaults full of gold just sitting around waiting to be seized. The wealth was always in the movement, in the trade, the transit taxes, the financial services, the caravan commerce that flowed through the city every season. The Moroccans crossed the Sahara expecting to find a dragon's hoard, literal treasure rooms piled with gold bars. Instead, they find a functioning commercial economy, which is actually much more valuable in the long run, but you can't pick it up and carry it home. Frustrated and increasingly aggressive, the Moroccan forces start demanding that scholars and wealthy families pay enormous cash tributes immediately. When people can't pay, or won't, soldiers begin confiscating property, and then they reach the libraries. What happens next is the thing that, even 600 years later, makes historians physically wince. Soldiers who have no idea what they're looking at. Men who cannot read Arabic, who have no concept of manuscript culture, who see old books as worthless clutter rather than irreplaceable repositories of human knowledge. Start using manuscripts as kindling, as food wrapping, as packing material for looted goods. Texts that took months to copy by hand. Books that cost the equivalent of small fortunes to acquire. Documents containing unique knowledge that exists nowhere else on Earth. Just burned, casually, by people who literally don't know what they're destroying. Every single one of those losses is permanent. You cannot recreate a unique medieval manuscript. You cannot reconstruct surgical techniques that existed only in one text. You cannot recover the specific historical records, the original mathematical proofs, the poetry, the astronomical charts that go up in smoke in a soldier's campfire in 1591. When that knowledge burns, it burns forever. The scholars who can flee do. They pack whatever manuscripts they can physically carry and scatter in every direction. Jenne, Gao, Egypt, Morocco, smaller towns and villages where they have family or former students who will shelter them. It is a brain drain of catastrophic proportions happening in weeks. Where Sankura once had 25,000 students engaged in the most advanced scholarship in the medieval world, within a few years there are hundreds. The libraries that remain are shadows. The intellectual ecosystem that took 2 centuries to build is shattered in a single season of violence. Here's the detail that breaks your heart open completely. Some families, the ones who don't flee or can't flee or refuse to abandon their homes, bury their manuscript collections to protect them from the soldiers. They dig underground chambers in floors and courtyards. They wrap books in leather and oilcloth against moisture. They hide them, planning to retrieve them later when things calm down. Sometimes they never get the chance. Family members who know where the manuscripts are buried die before they can pass the information on. Or they flee the city and never return. Or they return and the landmarks they used to remember the hiding spots are gone. These secret libraries stay underground for decades, for centuries. Some have been rediscovered in recent years by researchers who noticed anomalies in the soil. Others are almost certainly still down there right now, somewhere under Timbuktu streets. Irreplaceable medieval manuscripts in waterproof containers, buried and forgotten, waiting. The Moroccan occupation itself disintegrates into farce. Morocco is simply too far away to govern Timbuktu effectively. Supply lines across the Sahara are unreliable. The soldiers sent to occupy the city start going native, intermarrying with locals, building their own power bases, becoming more interested in enriching themselves locally than sending revenue back to Marrakesh. The army that conquered Timbuktu eventually becomes its own ruling class, called the Arma, disconnected from both Morocco and the original Timbuktu power structures. Political chaos calcifies into permanent instability. Trade continues, but at a fraction of previous levels. The Portuguese coastal routes have already siphoned off most of the gold trade. Now, with political chaos added to economic decline, even more merchants route their commerce elsewhere. The city that was the hub of West African trade becomes a regional market town, still inhabited, still locally significant, but not globally important. Not the center of anything anymore. The confidence drains out slowly. That sense of being at the absolute center of the world, the pride in scholarship, the feeling that Timbuktu matters beyond its own borders. What replaces it is something sadder. A city that talks about its past instead of its present. A place whose greatest stories are all in the past tense. For now, jump forward 400 years. You're in 2012, And Timbuktu is facing something horribly familiar. Islamic extremist groups, Al-Qaeda-linked militants, and a faction called Ansar Dine have seized control of northern Mali, including Timbuktu. And these men have a specific, violent ideology about what constitutes acceptable Islam. Centuries-old Sufi shrines don't make the list. Ancient manuscripts don't make the list. The entire intellectual tradition that Timbuktu spent 500 years building doesn't make the list. You watch militants take pickaxes to the mausoleums of Timbuktu's saints, burial sites of great scholars that locals have venerated for generations, UNESCO World Heritage Sites, and methodically smash them to rubble. Not in a frenzy, deliberately, ideologically, because they have decided that venerating scholars at burial sites constitutes idolatry, and idolatry must be destroyed. 500 years of history hammered into gravel in an afternoon. But then the militants turn their attention to the manuscripts, the private libraries, the family collections that have survived the Moroccan invasion, survived colonial occupation, survived civil wars and coups and decades of poverty and neglect. The extremists want those destroyed too. Sufi texts, scientific manuscripts, philosophical works, poetry, anything that represents Timbuktu's tradition of diverse and open-minded scholarship. To them, it's all heresy. It all needs to burn. This is where the story pivots. This is where Timbuktu stops being a tragedy and becomes something else entirely. A man named Abdelkader Haidara decides he will not let it happen. Haidara is a librarian and manuscript conservator. Not a soldier, not a politician, not someone with any conventional form of power. He is a man who has spent his career understanding exactly what these manuscripts are and exactly what their loss would mean. He knows these aren't just old books. They are the physical, tangible, irrefutable proof of Africa's intellectual history. They are the counter-narrative to every racist assumption about what African civilization was and wasn't capable of. They are evidence, the kind of evidence that, once destroyed, cannot be reconstructed or replaced. And he organizes one of the most remarkable rescue operations in the history of books. Haidara builds a network. Librarians, scholars, manuscript owners, ordinary citizens who understand what's at stake, all recruited quietly, carefully, in a city under armed occupation where the wrong conversation overheard at the wrong moment could get everyone killed. The plan is straightforward in concept and terrifying in execution. Get the manuscripts out of Timbuktu before the extremists find them. We are talking about hundreds of thousands of documents, some of them 600 years old, some of them so fragile that handling them incorrectly could cause irreparable damage. They pack them into metal trunks, hide them in vehicles, conceal them under ordinary household goods. Rice sacks, family belongings, the kinds of things that don't attract attention at a checkpoint manned by armed men with a mandate to destroy exactly what's being hidden underneath the rice. Every journey is a potential death sentence. If the militants discover what they're doing, everyone involved will be killed. No ambiguity about that. No negotiation. These men have already demonstrated, with pickaxes on ancient mausoleums, exactly how they respond to what they consider cultural transgression. And yet the network operates. Night drives on back roads, checkpoint bribes, cover stories rehearsed until they're reflexive. Just family belongings, just household goods. Hundreds of thousands of irreplaceable medieval manuscripts smuggled past armed extremists in the dark. The manuscripts travel south to Bamako, Mali's capital, where they're dispersed into private homes, office buildings, any space that offers reasonable security. The network is deliberately decentralized. If one location is discovered, the rest survive. It's the same logic their ancestors used when they buried manuscripts during the Moroccan invasion 400 years earlier. Scatter and protect, hide and wait. Here's the detail that stops you cold. Some of the families participating in this rescue operation have been protecting these specific manuscripts for 15 or 20 generations. These are not abstract cultural artifacts to them. These are family heirlooms that their great-great-great-great-grandparents treasured, that survived every catastrophe Timbuktu has ever faced, that have been passed down with explicit instructions. Protect these, no matter what. The weight of that generational responsibility is almost incomprehensible. They do it anyway. Not everything is saved. Militants discover some collections before they can be moved. There is footage, real, documented, heartbreaking footage, of extremists throwing manuscripts into fires and watching them burn. Texts that survived 6 centuries of desert heat, Moroccan invasion, colonial seizure, and decades of neglect. Destroyed in minutes by men who don't understand or don't care what they're burning. Historians estimate approximately 4,000 manuscripts are lost. The exact number will never be known. Each one is a unique, permanent, irreversible loss. But the majority survive. Roughly 350,000 manuscripts make it out of Timbuktu through Haidara's network. The French military intervention in 2013 pushes the extremists out of the city, and when the dust settles, the scale of what was accomplished becomes clear. An untrained civilian network, operating in secret, under constant threat of violent death, smuggled the majority of one of the world's most significant manuscript collections out of an occupied city. Using rice sacks. The international response when the rescue operation becomes public is overwhelming. Funding pours in for proper archival facilities. Digitization projects launched to create permanent digital backups of every surviving text. Conservation specialists arrive to assess and repair damage. Haidara and his team are recognized globally as heroes, which they are, unambiguously, completely, heroes. And here's the brutal irony the extremists never anticipated. By threatening Timbuktu's manuscripts, they drew the attention of the entire world to them. The global press coverage of the rescue operation does more to publicize Timbuktu's intellectual heritage than decades of academic papers and museum exhibitions combined. Suddenly, everyone is asking, what exactly is in these manuscripts? Why did people risk their lives for them? What did medieval Africa actually know? The answers, as you now know, are extraordinary. Cataract surgery in the 1400s, astronomical calculations of stunning precision, mathematical proofs, legal scholarship that shaped an entire civilization, historical records of a world that Europeans hadn't even mapped yet, medical knowledge that predates its European equivalents by generations. Proof, stacked in metal trunks, smuggled in rice sacks, hidden under floors, that the story we've been told about African history is radically, demonstrably incomplete. The extremists wanted to erase that proof. The librarians made sure it survived. So here's where we land. You've walked through Timbuktu's salt markets and watched 12,000 camels disappear into the desert horizon. You've stood in Mansa Musa's caravan and watched one man's generosity crash an entire country's economy. You've sat in Sankor's lecture halls while students 600 years ago calculated the movements of planets with tools that look like steampunk jewelry. You've watched the Crépissade, an entire city climbing wooden scaffolds together to give their mosque a new skin before the rains come. You've seen the Moroccan soldiers burn what they couldn't understand. You've watched librarians stuff irreplaceable medieval manuscripts into rice sacks in the middle of the night and drive past armed checkpoints praying nobody looks too closely. You've seen the whole arc. Rise, fall, near erasure, survival. And now I want to tell you what it means. Not the romanticized version, the real version. Here's the first thing. The word Timbuktu is still used right now in the English language to mean the middle of nowhere, a place so remote and irrelevant it barely exists. Think about how staggering that is. We took the name of a city that housed the most advanced university in the medieval world, a city that controlled half the world's gold supply, a city whose scholars were performing cataract surgery, while European physicians were still recommending bloodletting as a cure for everything. And we turned it into a punchline, a synonym for nothing, a joke your parents made when they wanted to describe somewhere unimportant. That didn't happen by accident. It happened because when European explorers finally reached Timbuktu, exhausted, sun-damaged, arriving centuries too late to see the city at its peak, they found a struggling desert town in long decline and couldn't reconcile what they saw with what they'd expected. They'd been chasing the legend of a city paved with gold. What they found was earthen buildings and poverty and the quiet dignity of a civilization that had already survived more catastrophes than most European cities had faced in their entire histories. So they wrote it off. They dismissed it. They went home and told stories about how Timbuktu was a disappointment, a myth, a nowhere place. And those stories calcified into language, into a word that means nothing. What they missed, what they couldn't see because they didn't know how to look, were the manuscripts, the libraries, the intellectual tradition still alive in those earthen buildings. The families still protecting book collections their ancestors had assembled over centuries. The scholars still teaching, still writing, still carrying forward a tradition of learning that had survived the Moroccan invasion and colonial occupation and was about to survive the 2012 extremist occupation too. The real Timbuktu was always invisible to people who only knew how to look for gold. Here's the second thing, and this one's important. Timbuktu's story is not exceptional in the way we usually mean that word. We say something is exceptional when we mean it's surprising, unusual, a departure from the norm. Wow, an advanced African civilization. How exceptional. But that framing is itself the problem. Timbuktu wasn't exceptional. It was one of multiple sophisticated, wealthy, intellectually vibrant African civilizations operating simultaneously. The Great Zimbabwe, the Kingdom of Congo, the Swahili coast city-states, the Aksumite Empire. Advanced, complex, globally connected societies that traded with China and Persia and India and the Arab world for centuries before a single European ship rounded the Cape of Good Hope. These civilizations aren't footnotes. They're not exceptions. They're the norm. Africa's actual history, which is incomprehensibly richer and more complex than the version most people were taught in school. Timbuktu is the door. Walk through it and the room on the other side is enormous. Here's the third thing, and this one is about what gets lost when history gets lost. Those 4,000 manuscripts that burned in 2012. Think about what might have been in them. We know Timbuktu's scholars were working on medicine, on astronomy, on mathematics, on engineering, on law, on philosophy. We know they were centuries ahead of European practice in several fields. We know they were producing original scholarship, not just copying knowledge from elsewhere. What we don't know, what we can never know now, is exactly what specific insights, discoveries, and ideas were contained in the texts that burned. Maybe nothing that changes anything. Maybe some of it was replicated elsewhere, preserved in other manuscripts that survived. But maybe not. Maybe somewhere in those campfires in 2012, something irreplaceable disappeared. A surgical technique, a mathematical proof, a historical record of events that now have no witness. Knowledge that took a human being years to develop and document, gone in minutes because armed men decided old books deserved to burn. This is why the librarians risked their lives. Not for sentiment, not for abstract cultural heritage, for the specific, practical understanding that knowledge, once lost, does not return. That the past is not a resource you can mine indefinitely. It's a finite thing, and every act of destruction makes it smaller and smaller and smaller, until one day someone asks a question that nobody can answer anymore, because the answer burned 400 years ago in a soldier's campfire. Haidara and his network understood this. The families who hid manuscripts under their floors during the Moroccan invasion understood this. The scribes who spent their lives copying texts that already existed understood this. The students who traveled from Persia to study in the Sahara Desert understood this. Knowledge is worth protecting, sometimes worth dying for. Here's the fourth thing. Look at what Timbuktu actually teaches us about wealth and power and how civilizations rise and fall, because it's a lesson that applies with uncomfortable directness to the present. Timbuktu's wealth was not based on conquest. It was not built by taking things from other people at sword point. It was built on being useful, on occupying the right position in a network and facilitating exchanges that benefited everyone involved. The salt merchants needed the gold markets. The gold markets needed the salt. Timbuktu needed both of them, and they needed Timbuktu. And the whole system worked because everyone got something from the arrangement. That model is also how it falls. When the Portuguese find a coastal route that cuts out the middleman, Timbuktu's usefulness to the network declines. Not because anyone attacks it, not because it does anything wrong, simply because the network finds a more efficient path, and the city that was perfectly positioned for one kind of trade is suddenly peripheral to another. The wealth drains not through violence, but through irrelevance. Every city that's ever been an economic powerhouse should sit with that for a moment. Competitive advantages are not permanent. Being the center of something today does not guarantee being the center of anything tomorrow. The question is always, what happens when the roots change? What do you have that isn't dependent on geography or circumstance? For Timbuktu, the answer turned out to be knowledge. The manuscript survived when the gold trade didn't. The intellectual legacy outlasted the commercial empire by centuries. That's not nothing. That's actually everything. Here's the fifth thing, and it's the one I want to leave you with. Timbuktu is still there. The population is smaller now, around 55,000 people, compared to the 100,000 residents and 25,000 students of the Golden Age. The economy is difficult. Tourism dried up after 2012 and has been slow to return. Young people leave, heading south to Bamako or further, because economic opportunity is limited and the security situation in northern Mali remains unstable. The sand is advancing. Desertification creeping forward year by year, swallowing abandoned buildings, reclaiming streets, slowly returning parts of the city to the desert that surrounds it. And yet, the crépissage still happens. Every year, before the rainy season, the community of Timbuktu still climbs those wooden scaffolds and replasters the walls of the Jingarebe Mosque together, in the same way they have every year for nearly 700 years. The same gesture, the same collective labor, the same act of saying, this building matters, this community matters, this continuation matters, and we will do what needs to be done to make sure it survives another year. The manuscripts are still being catalogued and conserved at the Ahmed Baba Institute, digitized page by page, backed up on servers so that even if the physical documents are somehow lost, the knowledge they contain will survive in another form. Families still guard their private collections, still feel the weight of generational responsibility to protect what their ancestors preserved. The mosques still call people to prayer 5 times a day, the same way they have since Mansa Musa's architects built them in the 14th century. Students still study, scholars still teach. The intellectual tradition is diminished, fragile, chronically underfunded. But it is not dead. It is alive in every person in that city who understands what happened there and chooses to stay. That's resilience. Not the inspirational poster version. Not triumphant, not glorious, not Instagram ready. The real kind. The kind that doesn't look like winning from the outside, that looks like surviving, like persisting, like doing the necessary maintenance year after year, even when the world has mostly forgotten you're there. The kind that buries books in the ground to protect them from soldiers and digs them up 400 years later, still legible. The kind that smuggles centuries of human knowledge past armed checkpoints in rice sacks. The kind that rebuilds what extremists demolish with pickaxes, using the same traditional techniques the original builders used so that the structure that replaces the rubble is also an act of cultural continuity. That's Timbuktu, not the myth, not the nowhere place joke, not the failed El Dorado that disappointed European explorers who were looking for the wrong thing entirely. The city that was richer than Rome. The city that housed the most advanced university in the medieval world. The city that controlled half the world's gold supply and used the proceeds to build libraries. The city whose scholars performed cataract surgery in the 1400s and calculated planetary movements with brass instruments and wrote original mathematics that Europe wouldn't catch up to for centuries. The city that fell. The city that nearly burned. The city that survived anyway because people understood that what it represented was worth more than any individual life, worth more than safety, worth more than the very real and rational fear of what happens when armed men find out what you're hiding in the back of your car. So the next time someone uses Timbuktu as a punchline, as a shorthand for nowhere, for irrelevance, for the kind of place that doesn't matter, you can let it go. You don't have to say anything, but you'll know. You'll know about the 25,000 students and the gold leaf manuscripts and the mud mosque that heals itself every year. You'll know about the king who crashed Egypt's economy on vacation. You'll know about the librarians in the dark with the rice sacks. You'll know about the books buried under the sand, waiting. You'll know that Timbuktu doesn't mean nowhere. It means somewhere. Somewhere specific, somewhere extraordinary, somewhere that happened and mattered and still exists and refuses, through everything history has thrown at it, to disappear. That's the story. That's all of it. Now you know.